Hello, my sweet friends. This is Becka. How is your heart today? I want to introduce you to a conversation that Olivia and I got to have with the author and writing teacher Laura Davis. Laura has authored 6 books, which have sold over 1.8 million copies worldwide and have been translated into 11 languages. We are thrilled to share this conversation with you as we talk with Laura about her newest book, The Burning Light of 2 Stars. Her latest work weaves memoir and fiction together, and in our conversation, we dive deeper into the mother-daughter relationship she experienced growing up, which is the focus of her latest book. Talking with Laura, we came to an even deeper appreciation of the importance of learning the details about the stories we tell ourselves from our childhood memories. An important note, we do discuss some family trauma in this conversation, so just be aware of that. But we are so excited for you to join us in this conversation. And one quick note before we get excited, we are excited before we get started, is that the CYP Con is coming up starting November 10th at 4:30 p.m. Eastern. Now you might ask, what is the CYP Con? The Check Your Privilege Convention is an annual 4-day virtual learning experience designed to equip co-conspirators like you and I with actionable strategies to overcome the challenges faced living into the work of anti-racism. And this isn't your typical conference. This is an immersive experience which is designed to inform and really inspire and support and guide us to live into the work of anti-racism. Our good friend and author Maisha Hill and her team have created this virtual learning experience, and it's created to be accessible for all schedules and all people. The online live sessions will happen in the latter part of each day, and if you can't make a session, that is totally okay. Your ticket gives you access to the recordings of each session. And this year, we're so excited to share with you that Tommy Allgood, who also happens to be a Permission to Be co-host, will be one of the guides at the CYP Con. The conference starts November 10th. You can purchase tickets the day of the event. For tickets or more information, you can go to checkyourprivilege.co, or the link for tickets is in the Permission to Be podcast Instagram bio. Now, without further ado, the conversation with Laura Davis. Hello, and welcome to Permission to Be.
Let's hit him with a remix.
Oh, well, y'all got to change that.
Yes.
What do we do?
We leave our F-bombs in and...
Let's tell some stories.
As long as white people are bound, the people in power are bound, they're going to keep us bound to the same thing that they're bound to.
Out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. And I think out of the overflow of the spirit, the body does.
Challenge some narratives.
Why is that the best that God could offer you?
Mike made it very clear that he did not want to get any of these questions beforehand. So he is getting this question live, raw, for the very first time.
This is...
And I feel like art is the expression of the heart where words fail.
Oh my goodness, I have tears. Oh, y'all are killing it.
Unfiltered.
I feel like that's gotta sound strange.
Permission to Be.
Actually, my literary agent, when we were talking about what book might I write, he was like, I mean, A Black Man with Hope is an interesting book.
Oh, shit.
Hello, everybody. We've got Olivia and Becca here.
Everybody.
Tonight, we have the honor of speaking with Laura Davis. Laura is a well-known author of several past books. One in particular, The Courage to Heal, which just had its 30th anniversary re-release. And Laura has re-entered the world of publishing for the first time in a couple of decades with a new memoir, The Burning Light of 2 Stars, A Mother-Daughter Story. And so how I'm connected to Laura, I met her through another Laura, my writing teacher, Laura Lentz. And I had the privilege of being a beta reader of the manuscript of the upcoming book. And a big part of the reason I'm such a fan of this work is because it's not the type of book I normally pick up. I'm not a big reader of memoir, and yet I was so engrossed with this 88,000 word manuscript that I devoured it in 4 days. And that is saying a lot for me because I'm in 4 different book groups. And so at any given time, I've got 4 different books going. So when hers riveted me and held my attention, I was like, oh my God, this is good writing. And it's not even the kind of book I normally read. So I've been excited about it since I first knew it was coming out. It's the quality of the writing. It's compelling narrative storytelling at its finest. And so for that reason, I asked her to come and chat with us so we could learn from her a little bit about an overview of the book and what led her to return to the publishing world after this absence, and to share a little bit of her backstory. So, Laura, welcome to Permission to Be.
I'm just so happy to be here talking to you. Been looking forward to it a lot.
We are so glad to have you. So why don't you start by telling us about yourself, who you are, what you do, what you've done. And I know that's a big story, but just wherever you want to go with that.
Well, I think that the one thing that has been continuity in my whole life is that I've been in love with words since I was a little girl. And I've used words, at first as a way to understand myself, as a way to seek answers, to try to find the truth, to speak the truth, absolutely, to break silence, to confront people, to grieve, and to make my most critical life decisions. And they usually happen on the page. And in the public sphere, which I've been doing since I was a teenager, I've been published. I've used words to provoke, to inform, to agitate, to educate, to tell stories, to entertain, and to inspire. And I published my first book, The Courage to Heal, which I co-wrote with Ellen Bass. I was only 31 years old when that book came out. And it was a book about the process of healing from child sexual abuse. And we published it in 1988, it was the first book of any kind that really talked about how to heal from trauma, from this kind of trauma. And it was the first book that really gave hope to survivors of child sexual abuse. And it took off in this way that just totally blew me away. I mean, when we were writing the book, I didn't even think it would get published. We had a book contract with Harper and Row, and I just thought the book was too radical, and that when our editors saw it, they would reject it.
Oh, wow.
I was certain of that, because it was, basically really confronting the patriarchy. It was, it was poking a hole in male violence and male domination. The book was full of lesbians. I mean, I just thought, oh my God, they're never going to want to publish this. But they did. And it became this incredible grassroots bestseller, just passed from woman to woman to woman to woman. And this was pre-internet. So, nobody was posting about it on Facebook or Instagram. There was no email. I mean, this was really word of mouth in the most basic way. And it was for me really a shocking experience and a humbling experience to have created something or co-created something that had this huge impact. I mean, it really started the incest survivor empowerment movement of the late 80s and early 90s. It's the precursor of Me Too. And it was an amazing kind of heady experience, and also challenging, because I was young. I didn't have the kind of spiritual grounding or the emotional stability to handle that kind of sudden, meteoric notoriety for the worst thing that had ever happened to me. And I also was deep in my own healing process. I was going to therapy a couple times a week. I was obsessed with sexual abuse. I was having flashbacks. I was a mess. Wow. And I wasn't really, but there I was in this position where wherever I went, women would come up to me and tell me their abuse stories, including I'd be at the movies and someone would follow me into the bathroom.
Oh my gosh.
And it was just, I remember I used to lie about who I was, my name, what I did, and and then, eventually I was able, and then I had to, there was the public me, who was this icon, I guess, for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of women. And then there was my private life, which was still really falling apart because I had a lot of healing to do still. So at that point in my life, there was a lot of a split, I guess you would say. The other thing that happened at that time is that the book, my decision to publish that book and then its notoriety. So I was, on national TV talking about my grandfather's sexual abuse, and it really created a huge rift with my mother and her whole side of the family. So it was sort of like I gained the world and I lost my family. So that was where I was at in my early 30s. I wrote a few more books about sexual abuse. And then I got to a point where it was sort of at the peak of my, I guess you could call it success with this, is I left. I walked away from it because I didn't want to be identified anymore, have myself identified with being an incest survivor. I mean, it's not that I wasn't, but I didn't want that to be my identity in the world. And I had done enough healing that I wanted other things in my life. I wanted a personal life. I really wanted a family. I wanted to see who I could be as a healed person and not always have this be my identity. And so I kind of stepped out into this void of not knowing what was next. And then from there, I wrote several other books, and I wrote a book about, my books kind of correlated with what I was doing in my life. So, when I had my first son, I teamed up with a great parent educator, and we put together a book called Becoming the Parent You Want to Be. When I started working on reconciling the relationship with my mother, I wrote a book called I Thought We'd Never Speak Again, The Road from Estrangement to Reconciliation. And then during that time, after The Courage to Heal came out, I started working with a lot of writers. So for the last 25 years, I have coached writers. But what I really love is working with writers in groups, in classes and retreats and workshops, and creating a safe place where people can use writing as a tool for healing, for transformation, for self-expression, and for community building.
I was going to say community. Yeah.
Definitely community. I don't work with people individually, and that's why. I never was interested in really being a coach or I never wanted to be a therapist. People suggested I get trained to be a therapist. I didn't want to. I like groups. I like group dynamics. And I love the synergy that happens when one person tells the truth about their life and they break silence in some way. And it doesn't have to be trauma. It could be, like in a group, I'm always happy if someone writes about money or sex or these topics that people generally don't write about. It's like suddenly everyone in the group starts writing about those topics because it's sort of like, it's okay to write about this here.
The freedom.
So that's what I love. I love I love group dynamics, and I love creating a safe space for people to use words to heal. And I am a writing teacher, but really I'm a community builder more than anything else.
Oh, I love that. That's what, as human beings, we were created humanity was created to work together. You know, that's at the essence of who we are as creatures, as from the beginning, as, even going up as far as evolution, it's always, we worked in herds and groups, and, that's how we functioned.
Yeah. And I think we become isolated, and so, and also when you are really revealing something about yourself, even if you're talking to your spouse, your best friend, your sister, your brother, even someone you trust, if they're going to have a reaction, which might be, you can't say that about mom, or, I don't remember it that way. You get any group of siblings together, right?
Yes.
Yeah. They do not remember the same event the same way. It's like everybody's like, it didn't, that's not when it happened,
Especially if there's a middle child.
Yes. Right.
My sister remembers things that my brother and I say never happened.
Right. That's right.
Sorry, Olivia, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, I have been in one of Laura's writing groups, and then she and I have been in a writing group with the same teacher. And until this whole COVID pandemic thing, just the whole notion of like write together in a group. I didn't really get how that works, but what she's saying about the synergy, I can't tell you how many times, we set aside this quiet time for everybody to go off and write. And then we come back and so many people, like she said, are following a common theme. So it's like there's something that happens there. And there is, I don't know, there's something really freeing about being heard and having a safe space to do that. So I just wanted to concur with that. And then I wanted to ask another question, something I realize I don't know, because you had written a previous book about your mother, the one I Thought We'd Never Speak Again. And then you wrote this memoir. So what made you, can you talk a little bit about what led you to writing this one?
Well, I guess you could say I've been obsessed with my mother. I mean, the first time I published about her, I think I was 23 years old, and I had this poem that was accepted into an anthology by Tilly Olson, and which was, really cool for a young writer. Yeah. And it was about my mother, and so I've written about her a lot, but the I Thought We'd Never Speak Again is not really about my mother and I. I mean, there was a little thread in that book. It's like 350 page book. And there were maybe 10 pages or 12 pages that told little bits of the story with her. But mostly for that book, it was a how-to book, so it was very different. And I interviewed tons of people. Like I interviewed Vietnam veterans who went back to Vietnam. I interviewed restorative justice, like, a woman whose sister was killed by a drunk driver, and I interviewed her about the experience of going into this mediation in prison. I interviewed, people who were, there was a camp that had brought together Israeli and Palestinian teenagers. And so I interviewed them about what that experience was like and how they structured it. And then a lot of just family dynamics too, people who were not speaking to X, Y, or Z person. And some of them had what you would call maybe a successful reconciliation in whatever we kind of stereotypically think that is. And others were able to make peace, basically inside themselves, where a relationship with the other person just was not possible because they were too toxic or violent or disturbed or, abusive. So it just wouldn't be healthy to have any kind of actual connection, but there's still a pathway to feeling that sense of resolution with the relationship. So that book was about kind of all these different pathways to reconciliation. And I was motivated to write it because my mother and I were in a process of coming back together after a long estrangement. Right. And the thing that's interesting is that at that time, my mother and I even did, we had like a, what's it called? A photo shoot, the two of us to promote that book. And she supported me in the writing of that book. And I think I had this feeling like we really had resolved things, we had reconciled. But then, things really change. It's like in the length of a life that a lot of, things come at you that you don't anticipate. Right. And for me, the way that the memoir opens basically is that I'm at home and I've just gotten over a year of cancer treatment. I'm like ready for my life to settle down and to just have some normalcy. And my mother calls. She's 80 years old. She lives in New Jersey. I live in California, which is as far away from her as I could get without crossing an ocean. And she announces she's moving to Santa Cruz, which is my town. For the rest of her life. And so that's where the story starts. So, I end up, having this mother where there's this still really unresolved history, like underneath the surface of, the peace we've made. There's a lot of buried rage and unresolved things. And she comes and then suddenly the proximity of her living right there. And then she develops dementia and she's got all the symptoms, rage and anxiety and, and her filters are gone. So like all her bad habits come back and I was triggered all the time. So the book is really about that journey from the time she announces that she's coming until the end of her life. And, the question for me was, can I take care of her? Do I want to take care of her? And can I be the daughter she needs me to be, despite the fact that there's this big unresolved history. And, I don't think our situation was rather extreme, I would say, but I think there are millions of people who are in this position where they have a parent or someone who has betrayed them on some level, maybe not as dramatically as my situation, but in some way, and they're faced with, what do I do in that person's time of need? And it's a really challenging situation. So that's what this book is about. What do we do in those situations? And is it possible to open your heart to someone who has betrayed you in the past?
Do you think the reconciliation would have happened the way it had she not moved across the country?
I think geography was super important. Absolutely. Because, there was a period of time when we had been very estranged, and every interaction we had would, one of us would be raging and the other, that would be her. And I would be withdrawing. That was me. That was my MO. I would be hiding or withdrawing or sulking or going silent. And basically just putting up a wall all around me. And then, we'd have a visit and we'd have like one good day. And then things would completely disintegrate, and I'd be like cursing those goddamn non-refundable plane tickets, because I sure couldn't afford another ticket. Probably she paid for my ticket anyway, because, of where I was in my life. So, it was like that. And so we never really, there was no chance to build any new experiences. And she was the one actually who said to me, we need to do something about this distance between us, because until we could start building some new experiences together in the present, all we're going to have is this screwed up past.
Right.
All we're going to have is this bad history. And so, she started actually initially, and again, she announced this to me. This was years before she came for good, that she was going to start coming out to California in the winter for be like a snowbird, get out of the snowy New Jersey and come to California for 2 or 3 months. And she rented her own place. I mean, she never stayed with me. There was no way that was going to happen. I think for either of us, I think neither of us was really able to have that kind of proximity. And she would live nearby, and she was such a dynamic person. She always had tons of activities and friends, and she had 3 calendars because of all the things she was involved in, this class and that class, and this. She's an actor. She was in a play, and I almost had to make an appointment to see her. But she started coming, and at first I was like really begrudging about the whole thing. I didn't help her at all. But, it started, that began when I had my son Eli, and Eli is now 28 years old. So when he was born, I think we both, and I think this is true for so many people, that when you have children, it changes things. I mean, and I'm not saying it's always appropriate. I don't at all want to say it's always appropriate to rebuild a damaged relationship, because some people are just, as I said before, really toxic or abusive, and you don't want yourself or your kids around them. But that was not my mother. She just was incredibly difficult. And she had a lot of good qualities too. And I think when I had him, it was much more of a motivation on both our parts, to want to try to make things better. I wanted him to have her as a grandmother, and she really wanted him as a grandson. And so that's when she started visiting. And, at first it was really difficult. She'd say, she didn't like it that I let the kids express their emotions. She said they were spoiled rotten. What do you act like you live in a barn? When I had my daughter, and I would, I'm in California, I would nurse her in public, and my mother would be mortified, that I would just whip out my breast and nurse her, and I would be mortified, that she was a closet smoker and she drank too much. And I mean, we could get triggered so quickly.
Right. Just bounced off each other.
But, by the time she'd come out here for like 7 or 8 years, it actually started to change, because the positive ledger started building up. And we started to enjoy each other, and we focused on the things that we had in common. And at first it wasn't very many, but it started to build. And I feel like that was because she took that risk to cross that geographical bridge, that divide between us. So it really did make a huge difference. And at the end of her life, the proximity made a huge difference too, kind of in the opposite direction. It made things like I couldn't get away from her, both geographically and also because her needs just were escalating. And I was in the sandwich generation. I had 2 teenagers and I had this elderly mother who's had dementia, who denied it and wanted to live alone, but was not safe living alone. And I mean, it was just, and there are so many people in that situation, just feeling squeezed. I felt like I was in this vice. But I also wanted to, if possible, I wanted to fulfill this promise, I guess, of taking care of her. It was really hard.
There's one thing you said, You said, we had all these, I don't want to say negative, whatever, adversarial, fill in the appropriate adjective experiences. And you knew that if you didn't build new ones, then all you'd have to hold on to is the negative adversarial ones. Do you feel like, did you realize that in real time, or do you look back on it in hindsight and realize that's what we were doing?
No, I think I realized it in real time, and I mean, she talked about it, and I think it was true, and it was interesting experience writing the memoir because the early drafts of it, she was more the villain, and I was the wronged one. And I knew that was just a first draft. I mean, that was my starting point. But it was really important to me that we both be fully human and fully flawed in the way I presented us. And that actually has been the best. Like, I'm happiest when someone reads it and they say, on this page, I hated you and I was rooting for your mother, and on this page, man, she was a bitch and I was rooting for you. Like, I can't believe she did that. And that's what I wanted, and I didn't want to come off as, I don't like reading books where someone it's like a vendetta and someone it's a revenge book. I just find that totally boring. And I really am hard on my students who are going in that direction. And it may be a phase in the process of writing, but you can't stop there.
Right.
I mean, yes, it's great to rant. It's great to write a rant and to blame and to hate, and all that on the page is really important, but it's not the end point of something you want to publish.
One of the things that I think, I believe we all filter life through the lens of our experience. And coming from a corporate career in human resources where my whole job was about understanding people, I could do that with other people. But then, when it's your parents, well, that's a whole other story. Part of what hit me about it, I had a time, I guess it was probably about a year after my mother died. And all of a sudden, I just started replaying so many of the things that just stuck in my craw. And it was like something had happened with one of my own kids. And all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh. And I could see it from her perspective, but she was already gone. And I remember, my husband at one point was like, are you okay? Because I cried every day for like a month, because it was just like, all of a sudden I got it. And so one of the things that I have found recently as I study trauma is I'm just a much more curious person. Instead of what is wrong with you, Laura, is what happened to you? And as a child, it's just like, well, my mom's being rude. My mom's being obnoxious. My mom's being insensitive. But then I started to evaluate her backstory. She lost her mother at 18 months. She was raised by her 70-something-year-old grandmother who took care of her. But, she missed a whole lot of that nurturing mothering experience because my grandmother had a toddler dumped on her when she was fully retired. And again, when I started to play back some of the things that I thought was just being distant and disconnect through that lens, I saw the whole thing completely differently. And so what I feel like you did a very effective job of in this book, especially when you get into, you don't want to give away details, but there's just certain scenes that you paint where you allow us a glimpse into why your mom is being extra. And then, being the daughter, I understood your perspective all along because, that's kind of the role I was in my own relationship. But I feel like you did a very effective job of showing that there are two sides to this story. There was hurt on both sides. There was anger on both sides. There was misunderstanding on both sides. And it did not at all come across like, any one person was being blamed. And that to me was part of the beauty of it.
So I'm just curious, Olivia, and you may not want to talk about this, but I'm just curious of like one example of something you realized about your mother. Like, were you one of those moments of like insight where you was like, oh,
okay,
wait a minute.
Okay. I got one for you immediately. So at the end of her life, my mother, had multiple autoimmune disorders. She was in and out of the hospital. And sometimes she could just be downright just obnoxious. And one example that comes to mind is one day she had called me over and asked me to go get something at the store for her. And I was trying to clarify which brand she wanted. And I said, I just want to make sure so that I don't go to the store and, get the wrong brand. And, she started yelling and screaming at me. And I just remember getting furious and picking up my keys and walking out, saying, look, I'm trying to do you a favor. And, my father walking behind me trying to explain, she really just doesn't feel that great. And so the next day she called and apologized and said, I was just in a lot of pain. I shouldn't have taken it out on you. I was just speaking out of my pain and I'm sorry. And my response at the time was, I am a grown, however old I was at the time, 43-year-old woman, and you just think you can talk to me like a child at any time. Okay. So fast forward to May of this year, I had a situation where I didn't know what it was at the time, but it was a necrotic nerve attached to infected pulp. And I was in 10 days of the most excruciating pain I've ever experienced in my life. I was on hydrocodone, Motrin 800. It was not working. And it never stopped. And I was horrible because everything just set me on edge. You could say, what time is it? I was in so much pain and I was so miserable. And so once we got beyond that and I went and had oral surgery, I had to go back and apologize. And it was one of those aha moments of, oh, wow, sometimes you can be so caught up in the misery of your own physical pain that you are just a total and complete bitch to your loved ones. But I didn't, and I expected my loved ones to, I slept on the couch for 10 days. I didn't even go upstairs. Of course, you're supposed to understand. And it was just the realization but you didn't extend that same grace in the moment. That's just one example that's come back to me recently. My mother died 11 years ago, so I don't remember what the memory trigger was at the time that had me crying for a month. I've had several of those moments where again, it's so much easier to judge what somebody else is doing until you're in that situation yourself. So we want to extend judgment to somebody else, but then we want grace extended to us. And so, like I said, she died in 2011. So I don't remember what the trigger was in 2012 that set me off down that path. But this is just one example of it that has come up for me recently.
Yeah, those moments are really hard, but good, when we have to face that, our rigidity, and our judgments, were not wholly impactful. One of the things that was, really intense for me in the process, it took me 10 years to write this book, is that my mother and I had corresponded. And, this was, again, before email. So these were all handwritten letters. And I saved every letter I ever wrote to her, including journals that had like first drafts, like angry, ranting first drafts that were so different than the careful letters I eventually sent. Yeah. And I saved everything she ever sent me. And we wrote these long handwritten letters. And it probably, from the time I was like, 17, 18. I left home at 17. So probably 18 or 19 till I was in my early 30s, and they sort of petered out at that point, because that's when we kind of started to connect again. And it was really interesting because I had always said that my mother and I didn't speak for 7 years. Like, that was my mantra. And then I looked at these letters, and the letters happened the whole time.
Oh, wow.
So and then I started reading the letters, and there were so many times what was on the written page contradicted my storyline.
Wow.
And that's one of the themes in the book, is just how we create these stories about our lives, and then we repeat them over and over again, and it becomes like how we present ourselves to the world, or to an intimate person, or to a friend, or I'm the person who, and we cart out these stories, and they become like, this is really going to date me, grooves in a record.
Right. They're coming back.
Yeah, they're coming back, right. And we hold on to those stories, and they are not necessarily accurate. I mean, they're just, they're the way we frame that story, and then we just get entrenched in it. And so that was very humbling. I had many moments of crying and distress and shame and shock when I read some of the things that told a different story than the story I told. So that was kind of an amazing experience. And I included some of those letters. In fact, at first I wanted to do the whole book in letters. When I found those letters, I wanted to just have a whole epistolary book that would include those letters, and then new letters that I would write to my dead mother. And I actually wrote a whole draft of the book that took about a year. And before I realized, people started reading it and saying, it's not very engaging. Like, it feels like you two are having this private conversation, and I'm not. I had many false starts with this book. I tried to make it a play. I tried to make it a book of letters, before I finally settled on a memoir, when just had to write the damn thing. And I did keep some of the letters, even though many editors said, get rid of them. And I'm really glad I kept some. They're a very small thread, but it's really the only place my mother gets to speak in her own voice. Right. Not through the lens of me recreating her on the page, because it's her actual words in those letters. And some of the letters are like hostile and horrible, and some of them are like so loving and kind.
That is so deep what you said about your own words contradicting the story you had in your mind. There's a big jumbo crate upstairs, and because of this conversation, I'm going to go through it. But it's full of journals. And my husband's like, yeah, I had them stored out there. Some of the times over the years when I didn't understand you, I would go pick them up and read them. And he has latitude to do that.
And how are you with that?
Oh, no, I was totally fine with it. It's totally fine. Because some of it's, there are some of them date back to high school. So yeah, it wasn't at all a violation of my privacy, like that. It wasn't like that. But so there is literally like this big jumbo crate when he showed me where they were that I got. It's not a crate, a big jumbo plastic tub that I got from Target that's sealed.
Yeah.
So right. Now I'm just going to have to go like randomly pick up some and read. Cause now you sparked my curiosity about what stories am I telling in my mind about how things were 20 years ago that are going to be contradicted by what I said in real time.
Yeah, when I did it, it was really hard, because for one, I found that I'm not a big journal keeper. I'm not like a lot of writers. They keep journals for, their whole lives. And I've done it on and off, and I haven't really kept a journal in many years. But I pretty much only wrote when I was depressed.
Oh, wow.
Or unhappy. So the journals reflect a lot of misery. Yeah. And also, I was reading about my 20s, and it was like, I was working in these restaurants, and I was a lot of cocaine binges and like putting myself in these humiliating situations with men. It was before I came out, as a lesbian. And there was so much humiliation, and it was so painful to read about how lost I was. And it was so hard to find empathy for the young woman I was. And it was really painful to read those journals. I would like bargain with myself, like, okay, you sit in the chair for half an hour, and then there's a bar of chocolate, really good dark chocolate inside, and I often would just pass out and go to sleep because it was just too painful to read, or dissociate. But I kept going, and I had these little Post-its, and I would take notes as I went along, because I felt like I had to write a memoir, I had to get to know who I was at that age again, because that was really a critical time. But boy, it was painful. And I thought, then there was the whole thing about like, what am I going to do with these? And now they're in one of those tubs, just like you, the plastic, mine are turquoise plastic. And there's a big sign taped on the front that said, burn these if I die. Because, I wasn't ready to throw them out. And I do know a lot of people who've burnt their journals because they don't want other people to read them. And it's like, I don't want my children to read these journals. Because it's just like, I feel like it would be such a burden. I mean, they're old enough now that I don't need to have any, they're young adults, so I don't need to protect them. And they've read I've told them a lot of stuff about my life, but I just wouldn't want them to read it. I just wouldn't. Although, it's interesting, when my father died, and I was his executor. He died 18 years ago or something. Okay. I was his executor, and he left behind this journal. And my parents, my dad left our family when I was 13 or 14. We were in New Jersey, and he came to California to become a hippie. And he went to Esalen and went to all these like human growth workshops, and he took a lot of acid, and he was a hippie.
He's having a good time.
He was having a good time. It was about 1970, so it was just like dropout kind of thing. And when he went to Esalen, it was the summer he left us and he never came back. So I was like 13, 14 years old. He had this very detailed journal about this month-long program at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, which was some kind of like encounter group, which was very big at the time. Okay. And I found that journal, and I probably read it in my 40s. It was fascinating. I was so grateful that I got to read it. It gave me so much insight into him and his upbringing and his background. And I was super grateful. And my mother actually wrote a lot. And I had, when she died, I had a lot of her writings. It was really, really valuable. To just understanding, there's all the epigenetics of where we come from, you know, in terms of generations and trauma. But there's also just the family history it was really great to fill in a lot of gaps that I would never have known otherwise. So in that way, I kind of want to keep my journals, but, I sort of want to have the best of both worlds.
Well, yes, if something ever happens, I have to think about it. Now I really need to go see what's in there. But I think, and mine, like yours, it's not a consistent thing. They're all over the place. I'm not a consistent, I get up every morning and keep a journal. So it's consistent for 6 months. And, but like I said, there's one in particular that goes all the way back to high school. But I do think it gives a glimpse, because I've had to piece together, as I've learned more about my mother after the fact, so much of her life makes sense to me now. And I'm in a book group that we've spent the last 6 months reading about intergenerational trauma and how it shows up. And it's just like eureka. Some of this stuff I wish I had known before. But my husband always tells me, you learn when you know better, you do better. You learn what you learn when you learn it. We can't turn back the clock, but it definitely, it helps to understand that. I think a lot of times we forget that our parents were whatever age we're at that time at one time as well. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's like, okay, at one point, my mother was 20, she was 30, she was 40, she was all those ages, but, she was always 25 years older than me. There's one little section in the book where I talk about taking my daughter to college. It's her second year of college, and she was going to school on the East Coast. So we didn't see her very much. And the first year, when I took her, my mother had just died like 6 weeks before. So it was like huge, I just lost my mother, and then I'm losing my daughter, who was the last child, so becoming an empty nester. And it was just really devastating when she left, even though I wanted her to go. But then the second year I dropped her off and I didn't feel anything. Like I was waiting to feel devastated, and actually I felt free. And it was like, oh, I actually really like having my own life. I've been taking care of children for 25 years and my mother for, 8 years or whatever. And now
I have this freedom. And I suddenly got it that my mother felt the same, that when I would come to visit her, whether it was like a horrible visit or a good visit, or we were screaming at each other or enjoying each other, she was happy when I got back on the plane and went home, and she got to go back to her own life. And it's like, suddenly it was like this huge realization, like, you were real. You weren't just a foil for me. You were real. You had your own life. You know, she was a daughter, a sister, an actor, a teacher, a social worker. She had all these identities that had nothing to do with me.
That part.
And I didn't get that. Well, actually, that happened, I think I was 58 years old. So it took me a long time to finally see her as really human, and that I was just part of her life. Whereas to me, she was so larger than life always. She was this huge figure. And that was really a major turning point for me.
Do you think that the trauma that you experience, or that, you know, just we as humans in general, we hold on to, it causes us to linger and take longer to come into those spaces of seeing our parents as human, if that makes sense? Because, for example, I'm just thinking about the trauma. Sometimes we're left in we act out of survival mode. And so when we're responding to our parents, even though we're maybe 20 years past the trauma and they're still in front of us, we're not seeing their humanity. We're still responding to the trauma that they were either participated in or allowed to be. You know, does that make sense? And so sometimes I feel like that gives us a hang up.
You know, there's a joke in Buddhist circles, which is, you know, if you think you're enlightened, go home and spend the weekend with your parents. You know, so yeah, I think it's I think it's very, very challenging, and that there's I think that kind of traumatic experience, we hold on to it. For me, I saw my mother as dangerous, and she was dangerous to me at many points in my life. But I continued to hold her in that position even after I was emancipated, independent, financially, you know, independent from her, and having my own life, my own family. But there was still a way that when I saw her, I thought of danger. And then I would look for things that reinforced that trope. Yeah. Instead of looking for the good, and that's something I had to confront. Instead of looking for the good, I would reinforce all my negative feelings towards her. Like, that proves it. See? You know, instead of like, oh, we just had a wonderful moment, and building on the positive. And that was something my partner, Karen, really helped me with. She loved her mother-in-law, and she really encouraged me to focus on the good and not always be harping on the bad. But boy, I did not want to let go of that for a very long time.
When you say you saw her as a danger, how do you mean that? You mean like an emotional danger?
I saw her as, the way I think I described it was she was like a spider with this web, and she was just trying to draw me in. And I felt like she would devour me, you know, and that wasn't very realistic when I was an adult. But I think there was still this residue of feeling like she was just this overpowering force, like this tsunami coming at me, and I had no power, even though I had plenty of, you know, agency at that point in my life. But it was still a lingering belief underneath the surface that influenced how I acted towards her, and how I thought about her, and how I criticized her.
I think that's part of what, there was a time when in one of my writing classes where we did this thing where you write about your mother. And my opening sentence was, as a little girl, I adored my mother. As a teenager and young adult, I resented my mother. In middle age, I understand my mother.
Yeah, that's nice.
And and then I went on to, now when we get off of here, I'm going to have to go find the essay and reread it. But that's what it seems like you kind of, went full circle with that, in that I felt this way, then I felt this way, and then I finally came full circle. I guess the one other thing that I'd like to hear you expound on, because you were clear at the beginning that we were able to reconcile, and through a very challenging process that took place over the final years of her life, we came back to wholeness. And that's not going to be everybody's story. But what do you think are the elements that are important or necessary for that type of reconciliation to take place?
Well, first, there's a lot of different kinds of reconciliation. So, that kind of reconciliation, I think, if you're really estranged from someone, you may long for the kind of thing where you have this deep conversation, everything is out on the table, the person acknowledges the way they hurt you, they apologize, you have come to this deep understanding, and then you go on and either you develop for the first time or reclaim this kind of intimate, safe connection. I mean, I think that's the fantasy. And sometimes it's like the deathbed reconciliation scene in the movies.
Right.
It's actually really rare for that to happen. I'm not saying it doesn't. It's if it happens, you're incredibly fortunate. But a lot more reconciliation is something like agreeing to disagree. Like, for instance, with my mother, there was this huge turd in the middle of the room, which was that I said her father abused me, and she said I was making it up, and that it wasn't true. And for many years, I was insistent and waiting and hoping and wishing that she would finally, acknowledge that. And she was hoping for many years that I would recant, which was like way too late for that. I'd been on national TV talking about this and, sold 2 million books talking about it. So it was too late for that. And so in that first stage of our reconciliation, we basically agreed to disagree, that this was an area we were going to stop trying to convince the other person. I mean, I think like that's very germane right now when you think about like the political divides in so many families.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you want to, maybe you choose not to have a relationship with that person, but if you do, there's a way that like you cannot talk about politics, or you can't talk about the election. And maybe it's just like, I just can't be around this person. But maybe maybe you really like to go fishing together, or maybe you love to cook together, or maybe you both love movies, or maybe there's some little thing that you could share where there's still some kind of thread of connection. And so, there's that level where you agree to disagree and you build a relationship around it. And then there's, the situation where one person changes, like us, I change because I've done a lot of work on myself and I no longer need what I needed before. And I gain that kind of perspective that we've been talking about, right? It's almost like flying up to much higher and looking down and seeing the much bigger generational picture and the picture of who that person was beyond you and from their parents and their parents' parents and the trauma that's been carried down. And you start to see a bigger picture. And sometimes that enables you to have a relationship with them where your expectations are very low. And then sometimes people get to the point where they can do that so that they could do things like go to the same wedding, or be in the same room without just wanting to throw up, and sometimes that's as good as it could get. And then there's like the last kind of reconciliation, which is, probably the one people want the least, is that it's really impossible to have any direct contact or relationship with that person, because the safest, most appropriate, sane choice is separation and distance. Because, the person is, there's just no possibility for a lot of different kinds of reasons, whether it's trauma or mental illness or addiction or, violence. There's a lot of reasons why you can't. But even then, I think it's possible to do that inner work of coming to terms with who that person is and reconciling with them on the inside and actually getting to the point of wishing them well, even though you may never speak to them again. And I remember this one woman I interviewed for the first book I wrote on reconciliation, and I'll never forget what she said. She said, I close the door, but the porch light is always open. I mean, the porch light is always on. And that just was such a beautiful image to me. It was like, there's a possibility. And in some ways, we never know. Like, I never could have predicted that my mother and I would end up on the trajectory we were. If you'd asked me when I was younger, I would have said absolutely impossible. I mean, that title I used, I thought we'd never speak again, was absolutely true for me. So I don't remember what your initial question was, but that was my long answer.
It was about what do you think is essential for reconciliation? And that was a great long answer. I mean, you just broke it down. There's different types, so you did answer.
Right. And I think, if you want to achieve something that's mutual, both people have to want it. And,
right.
Reconciliation does not happen when people are telling you, you have to forgive, you have to forget, you have to let go of it. I had so many people saying to me, Laura, even if this did happen, it happened 20 years ago, 25 years ago, aren't you ever going to let it go? Are you going to harp on this for the rest of your life? That is so not helpful.
No.
I think the only reason I was able to achieve any reconciliation with my mother is we had a complete separation, and that I had maturity was part of it, just time going by, but also I needed the autonomy of separating from her. And it was only from a place of being completely separate that I could look at her clearly and start to negotiate the possibility of reconnecting. And I think that's true in most instances.
What did self-care look like for you, Laura, going through all of this? There's different seasons, but I'm just curious, maybe if you share some examples of what self-care looked like.
I think, I started this whole interview talking about how important community is to me. And I think that's the number one thing is I've had really good friends. I have some friends I've had since first grade, since fourth grade, or since my young adulthood. And, I think one of the things is when I came out, I was 23, and, my mother's typical, very intense response was like, "You've confirmed my worst fear about you." That's where she was coming from. And it didn't, you could read to see what happened. I mean, she didn't stay there. But that was just her first reaction. So I think a lot of queer people have to build alternative communities away from their family. And so I did that. And those people that, I was really tight with in my early 20s, I'm really tight with a lot of them 40 years later. And so I think that was always huge for me, was having people who really saw me, really, really saw me and supported me and loved me. So, that was one. I've done a lot of therapy on and off in my life. I've done a lot of body work, things to get re-embodied because, for incest survivors in particular, we leave our bodies. So it's been a lifelong journey to stop dissociating, or at least to know when I'm dissociating and choose to come back. So that's been, and, writing as a tool for healing. I teach that all the time. So I've been writing for all these years. So writing absolutely has been part of my self-care. And, one of the really great things I got in my family was that we went camping a lot. And I was really taught to love nature. So nature is huge for me. I mean, it is right now. If I'm stressed, then I just go for a walk. I live where I live, there's the ocean 20 minutes in one direction, there's woods 15 minutes in the other direction. And I need to be out in nature, and it just replenishes me. So that's my church, definitely, is nature.
Yes.
So those are the things.
So Laura, your book has just come out. What are some places that you suggest, people can purchase your book, especially more on the local bookseller, smaller venue, or there's some places that you really love?
Yeah. So what I suggest is that people could go to my website, lauradavis.net/chapters. And I'm assuming you could put that in the show notes.
Definitely.
lauradavis.net/chapters. You could read the first 5 chapters of the book. So you really get a sense, is this book for me? And in the back of that are links to every bookseller, the couple big independent booksellers where you could look up the bookstore, the local independent store in your area. There's Barnes and Noble, there's Amazon because you have to sell there too. And there's also an audiobook and an ebook. So yeah, all those links are there, but really anywhere books are sold, you can find this book, The Burning Light of Two Stars. And to read the chapters, lauradavis.net chapters. There's one other thing that I created that I'd like to tell people about because I was talking so much about writing and being a writing teacher is that I created a free workbook, which is called Writing Through Courage, a 30-day practice. And you could get that on my site as well at lauradavis.net/courage. You don't have to be a writer to enjoy it. It's got lots of quotes and poems and really provocative questions, which you could either write about or, discuss over the dinner table.
Quick question. For your audiobook, are you by chance reading it?
Well, yes, actually.
Talk about that, Laura. She did something unique.
Because that's actually my favorite is to listen to authors. And I know it's a lot of time and effort, but it's just, there's a different energy when you're listening to a book that the author has written or the author is reading their own book.
Yeah, I mean, it was actually interesting because I decided after having 6 books with big publishers, I decided to go with a small hybrid press for this memoir. And so I hired my own audiobook production company, in part because I wanted to possibly do the voice myself. And I had, in my 20s, I was a talk show host and a news reporter in Alaska. And I love audio, just love it. I mean, that's why I love talking to you because it's just so much fun to have these kind of conversations. And so I sent basically an audition tape of me reading a couple of the chapters to the head of this audiobook company. Becky Geist is her name. And I said, I don't want to make a mistake by recording my own audiobook. I don't want to sabotage this project. Do you think it's good enough? And I really wanted her honest response. And she emailed me back. She said, "You're the most talented amateur I've ever heard." So that was great. So what we decided to do, which was and this is why it was fun going indie with this book, is I got to make all these decisions, and which at times was overwhelming. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to do myself as a character. I wanted to be the narrator, but I really felt like there was no way I could read my mother. I'm not a trained actor.
Yeah.
And this book is extremely character driven, and there's tons of scenes with a lot of conflict and lots of dialogue. So basically Becky is my mother and all the other characters. She's my wife, my 3 kids, the doctor, the nurse, all the other characters. And there's a lot of characters. She reads all of those. And then I read my own dialogue, my own inner thoughts, and the narration. And we had a setup, very similar to this. We would, we'd connect on Zoom, and then I was in my recording booth. She was in her recording booth. And we both were recording our tracks into separate. I was using Audacity. She was using something else. And then they all got uploaded, and, this engineer edited it all together. It was a huge undertaking. I mean, huge. I had to build a sound booth.
Wow.
I had to, because I couldn't afford $150 an hour to rent a sound studio. So, this is, I'm standing there right now. This is my office closet. I had to get these soundproofing blankets. I had to research them on the internet.
Yep.
I have this it's like foam, the kind of foam stuff they have on playgrounds under my feet.
Okay. Yeah.
And my son Brian built this shelf for me to put my computer on. I had to get the right microphone. It was huge undertaking. And we recorded I think every weekend for 3 or 4 hours, a couple of days. I think it took us about 10 sessions.
Okay.
To do the whole book. And I'm super glad I did it.
Oh, I'm super excited to listen.
I was hypercritical of myself. I would listen to it and I just think, oh my God, I'm going or yeah. But then other scenes were really good. I learned about my story things I didn't know just from writing it. I got into the emotion in a way I didn't any other way by reading it. There was something the human voice is such a instrument of emotion, and there was a lot of emotion in this book, and I felt it when I was reading it. So I think people have a very different experience listening to it than reading it themselves.
It makes so much sense because your body's holding that. That's in your muscles, your cells, your tissues. So when well, listeners, that you know what that means. You got to buy a hard copy and you got to do Audible. And even if you do Audible, you don't have to read the hard copy, but we always believe in encouraging everyone to purchase a hard copy to support the writers who do the very hard work. So, Laura, can you tell us, you've shared, are you on social media? Is there ways with people to connect with you there, or is the best way your website that you mentioned a little bit ago?
Well, the best way is my website, but I'm more active on Facebook than any other social media, where I dabble more, I guess. And I'm the Writer's Journey.
Okay.
Facebook Writer's Journey, and no apostrophe, just all crammed together.
Gotcha.
And it's linked to on my website as well. So, if you go to my website.
And we'll link it as well.
We have to ask her the who would play you in the movie question.
Sure do.
I hope there's a movie someday, because my mother was the most dramatic character I have ever known in my entire life. And she would love, from the grave, she would love to. In fact, she was an actor, as I said, and one time she got to be in a movie. It was like some little movie where she played an Italian grandmother, and she was thrilled that she got to do that. So, she would be ecstatic. I know she'd be like jumping up and down in her urn if there was a movie made about her.
Bouncing off her shelf, yeah.
So, in the movie, I think it would be Holly Hunter or Meryl Streep would play me, and my mother, absolutely Shirley MacLaine.
Without a doubt.
Wow.
It would have to be Shirley MacLaine.
I could see that. I could totally see that. Having read the book, I could totally see that. Well, Laura, thank you so much for taking this time to talk to us, to share with us. It has been a pleasure.
I've loved this conversation. It was so fun. You're great to talk to.
It has. We've loved having you. So, friends, remember to go and purchase your copy of Laura's brand new book and continue to follow her work via her website. And there are many more offerings in addition after you are hooked on the gifts that Laura has from her new release. Go and check out all of her other offerings, her several other books. So thank you again, Laura, for joining us this evening.
Yeah. And if you want to tell your own story, if that's part of your dream, I could help you with that too. So if you're a writer or a fledgling writer or an aspiring writer, or you have a book that you want to finish, come to lauradavis.net and you could check out those kind of offerings as well.
Yo, that was our show. Thanks for listening to Permission to Be. Thank you to our guests. So if you want more information, head on over to permissiontobepodcast.com to check out the show notes, get some more information on our guests that we post over there. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, leave a rating. If there's somebody that you want to see on this podcast telling their story, we also want to hear from you. So make sure to connect with us on Facebook and Instagram, Permission to Be Podcast, and we'll see you soon.